So we're taking a look at pollution in this lesson, guys, and we all know what pollution is. We've seen it. You've maybe been in big cities where you've seen things like this picture right here, where it kind of looks like a foggy day, but it's actually just the pollution that's in the air. I mean, pollution is everywhere, and we know that, and it has far-reaching effects and affects many different environments. We're going to take a look at a few specific effects that pollution has in this lesson. If you take a look at this slide right here, the main thing that we need to understand as it relates to pollution is that it decreases the amount of oxygen in water systems. And this is bad because we have a lot of aquatic life and a lot of organisms that live and depend on the water systems that are on our planet. And when we decrease the amount of oxygen in those systems, those organisms that depend on that oxygen, which are basically all of them, all fish and other aquatic life, they start to die off. And when they die off, the number and variety of those organisms goes down. And this is in reference to our first unit, biological diversity, where we said that, remember, a system is most apt to resisting major changes if it can maintain a certain level of biological diversity, and that there's lots of organisms that live there, and there's a wide variety of organisms that live there. But if through our polluting and pollution that we're putting into these areas decreases that biological diversity, well, now we're putting those ecosystems at risk for collapsing and other stuff. And that has far-reaching consequences, not just environmentally, but also economically and in our society in general. So one example of this that I wanted to go through with you guys is this example of something called an algal bloom. And an algal bloom is a result of pollution. Now, sometimes we don't necessarily think of fertilizers as pollution, where those fertilizers are used to help plants grow and things like that. But if we use excess fertilizers, those fertilizers can get into water systems. And, those fertilizers will seep down into the ground. It will get into the groundwater. The groundwater will carry those things to rivers and streams, and then those nutrients get carried to other places. And these nutrients, specifically phosphates and nitrates, when they get into a water system, it allows these algae species to proliferate and grow at extremely high rates. And algae is a type of plant, and so they really respond very, very well to these fertilizers that we use to help plants grow. And so if we have excess of these things in our water systems, these algae species really increase in their numbers very, very quickly. And that's why we call them algal blooms, is because these algae species really reproduce at very high rates. And this is bad because when they do this, it decreases the amount of oxygen in the water. Again, not a good thing that we want. And how this happens is that when we get lots of algae in water, then now you have lots of algae that eventually will die in the water as well. And when those algae organisms decompose and are decomposed by decomposers, those decomposers will use up the oxygen that's in the water in order for that decomposition to occur. And so when those decomposers are kind of working in hyperdrive to decompose all this dead plant material, that's what's causing this large decrease in oxygen in the water. And when you get a decrease in oxygen in the water to unhealthy levels, then this is the result right here, where you see aquatic life that starts to suffer and die off, which then, as I mentioned before, impacts the biological diversity of ecosystems. Now, this is a big deal because these fish and other types of vertebrates that might live in the water, as well as invertebrates, we use them and depend on them not only for the sustainability of ecosystems and making sure that the ecosystems don't collapse, but we also use them to help indicate what the quality of the water is. And so any organism that we use to indicate whether a water system is clean or polluted, we call them what we refer to as biological indicators. So they indicate, because they're living things, the cleanliness of certain environments, like say a water system, a river, stream, or a pond, or whatever. And so if we're killing off those biological indicators, then it makes it a little bit harder for us to be able to identify certain things about those water systems. Or if those certain vertebrates or invertebrates are absent from those water systems, then that kind of starts to indicate to us, hey, this ecosystem is not in a healthy way, and we need to try and figure out what's wrong so that we can hopefully try and correct the problem. Now, types of invertebrates that you need to know actually for this class are found in your textbook, and I'll show you a clip of that and a picture of that in just a minute. But these macroinvertebrates, so macro means that we can see them with the naked eye, and they're invertebrates, which means they don't have a backbone. These are just small organisms that we use to indicate the water quality of certain water systems. So even at the fish pond here in McGrath, we can see different types of these organisms in the water, and if we see them there, then that tells us that, hey, the fish pond ecosystem is in a pretty stable way. So here in your textbook on page 230 is a really good diagram showing how we use organisms, living things, to indicate the water quality of a particular system. So if we have a really clean aquatic area, then we're going to see, like I said, a wide range and variety types of organisms. So things like different types of fish like trout and perch and bass. And then we're going to see some macroinvertebrates, things like mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisfly larvae. And I'll show you some pictures of what those look like as well in just a minute. But if we have concentrations that sort of dip below this 8 parts per million level, then we start to get into some of these zones where we don't have as many of these organisms present, and we start to see some other types of organisms that start to thrive in some of these conditions. So other types of fish like carp and catfish, these guys thrive in waters that have a little bit lower concentration of oxygen, as well as leeches. And this is referred to as the decomposition zone. And then we can get into a septic zone where the concentration of oxygen is very low, 2 parts per million, and fish just cannot exist in these types of conditions. We see things like worms and mosquito larvae and midge larvae, and this is just a really dirty type of environment. And so depending on what organisms we see in that particular water system is going to tell us a little bit about the concentration of the oxygen levels in the water. And that's something that we need to know. On the next page in your textbook, page 231, you can see this table right here, which also kind of gives a lot of the same information. What organisms do we see in water where we have oxygen levels of between 8 to 10 parts per million? What organisms do we see in water qualities that have oxygen levels between 4 to 8 parts per million, and then 0 to 4 parts per million? And you can see these names of these organisms here. Now, being able to recognize what these organisms look like is part of what you do need to know for Science 9. And so in the textbook on page 233, you can see this picture right here that shows a variety of these organisms and what they look like. So some of the main ones that I really want to point out to you that you need to know are the water penny beetle, the stonefly nymph, mayfly nymph, dragonfly nymph, and the caddisfly larva. And so these ones right here, the caddisfly larva, dragonfly, mayfly, and stonefly, these guys are very sensitive to good water qualities. If the water quality is not very good, even if it varies a little bit from being very good, you will not see these organisms here. So if you can identify these organisms in a water system, then you know that that water system is good and has high water quality. Same thing with the water penny beetle. The one that's tricky here, though, is that the dragonfly, mayfly, and stonefly are kind of hard to distinguish between each other. And so here's the main feature that I always point out to help kids identify which one's which. So the dragonfly nymph kind of has this one prong coming out the back end of its body. The stonefly nymph has these 2 prongs coming out the back end, and the mayfly nymph has these 3 prongs coming out. The caddisfly larva is just a larva in a really sort of hard, rocky shell. And you can't really see that very well in this picture, but if you were to Google some images of that, you'd be able to see that. And then the water penny beetle are pretty easy to identify as well. And if you can determine the difference between these three, then you really are where you need to be. Worms, we know what those look like, and so all worms kind of look the same, and they're all in bad water quality. And that's it, guys. That's what you need to know. You need to be able to identify biological indicators, specifically these macroinvertebrates, and the water systems on page 230. That diagram is a very, very important one where it shows what organisms exist in clean zone, decomposition zone, and septic zone types of water qualities. So that's it. Thanks, guys, for watching.